Ebola reaches a major city for the first time. There's no cure and no vaccine. A mysterious killer and a search for answers. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. When an outbreak occurs, it hits hard and fast. Ebola is one of the most dangerous viruses known to man. It's rare, but kills as many as 90% of the people who get it. And it's mostly been confined to remote villages in Africa until now, because it's reached Conakry, the capital of Guinea, a city of 1.5 million. And as news of the outbreak spreads, a city on edge. Relatively little is known about Ebola. Scientists rush to the scene of each outbreak in the hope of finding out more. And underlying that urgency, the fear that one day it could begin to spread more easily. First, Erica Wood has this report.
Taking in the latest warnings, one of the deadliest viruses known to man has reached their capital city. With no known cure or vaccine, news of Ebola's spread is striking fear into Conakry's residents.
Since I heard about this disease, I've been afraid. Everyone has to protect themselves when drinking and eating.
People are being told to take precautions. The government's banned public funerals for Ebola victims to stop it spreading.
This
is the first time we've had this kind of disease in Guinea, and it's the first time the government has been preoccupied with a disease that doesn't have a cure.
And detection is difficult.
You cannot just look at a sick person and say he has it, but systematically, if it resembles Ebola, we'll send them to the Infectious Diseases Center.
The virus can cause severe fever, vomiting, diarrhea, organ failure, and internal bleeding. Up to 90% of those affected die, and the only course of action is quarantine. It's highly contagious, and it can be passed on just by touching an infected person or animal. It's believed this outbreak of the virus was originally transmitted to humans from bats in the forest regions of Guinea. The government has now banned the eating of bats and other bushmeats.
You see, I'm afraid. I have stopped eating meat.
This market, normally full of forest foods, is now empty.
We thought Conakry was safe, but now there are cases and people have died in Conakry. And the interesting thing there is it looks like they were not infected in the previously known areas. They were infected further to the north. So there is a risk that this disease is spreading already through Guinea. And, you know, without really good controls, it could spread through and into other countries.
It may already have spread. Neighbouring Liberia and Sierra Leone are investigating their own suspected cases. Erica Wood for Inside Story.
Well, let's hear from the scene of the latest Ebola scare, which is Conakry in Guinea. Just before the program, I spoke to Pano Saristo from the International Federation of the Red Cross. He's leading their field assessment team, and he told me that the issue of containment is critical.
Ebola does not yet have a vaccine, and there is no specific treatment. It's very important to reach the population with the right messages on how to avoid getting Ebola, how to avoid getting infected, and how to assume the right behavior so that you don't pass on the disease to others.
And of course, you have to have field people on the ground going and meeting those or finding those who have been in contact with diagnosed Ebola sufferers. So it's a massive logistical operation as well.
That's quite right. It takes a lot of manpower to trace the contacts of each case. And organizations like Doctors Without Borders are working with expertise down in the south and in the country, together with other partners such as the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent and the local Red Cross Society of Guinea. the Ministry of Health and United Nations to trace the contacts of these confirmed cases. That is a cumbersome work, and especially the volunteers of the local Red Cross can do an extraordinary work in tracing the contacts.
At what stage can you say this current crisis is over? Far too early?
It's far too early to say. Experience from outbreaks in other countries indicate perhaps a duration of 3-4 months, but it's really too early to say. It's also difficult to say from where you start counting 3 and 4 months. And what makes it even more difficult to predict is the fact that this is the first time Guinea is experiencing an Ebola outbreak, which probably makes the epidemic behave a little bit differently. So that's too early to say when this is over.
Paulo Saristo, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Although this is the first time Ebola has made an appearance in West Africa, there have been significant outbreaks before. It was first detected nearly 40 years ago in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. There have been a number of outbreaks there since. There have also been repeated cases of Ebola in Gabon and the Republic of Congo. And Uganda, where a particularly virulent epidemic in 2000 killed more than 400 people. And of course, most recently, there is Guinea, where, as we've heard, the virus has now spread from rural villages to the capital. Well, to discuss all of this, let's introduce our guests. In London, Dr. Ben Newman, a virologist at the University of Reading, and in Aberdeen, Professor Hugh Pennington, a professor of bacteriology. Welcome to you both. To begin with, Dr. Newman, part of the problem is that so little is known about this virus, is it not?
That's true. It's a very unusual virus. If you look back to the 1970s, this thing has been crossing over. We think it comes from bats each time, but each time the virus comes over to people, it's a little bit different. Now, this virus looks like the most deadly strain of virus. It's relative to the most deadly kind, so it's definitely a cause for concern.
Professor Pennington, that point about the virus changing each time it makes an appearance in the human being, there is a slightly different strain. There is a mutation going on, it would appear?
I don't know whether it's virus evolution. We know that there are several different kinds of Ebola virus, and some are milder than others, but even the mildest ones in Africa kill 25% of people, which is as nasty as smallpox used to be. So it is a very, very nasty virus. It's very difficult to study in the wild because basically all we can do is go in when there's an outbreak, look at the virus, study the virus, and that's all we've come up with, is that there are several kinds. They're all nasty, but some are nastier than others.
Well, Dr. Newman, you mentioned that the source is thought to be fruit bats. Certainly in this latest virus, there have been reports as well that it is from monkeys, that it is from porcupines, bush pigs. It would appear that the common strand in all of this is that it is food that is ate in particular regions. Would that be correct?
That's probably sadly true, and we think this is also the reason why HIV came to the human population from the bushmeat trade. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but we're talking about a part of the world where there aren't maybe cows and chickens that people can always eat. It's not only a delicacy, in some ways it's a necessity, I would say, over there.
Well, Professor Pennington, this issue of it would appear having its origins in animals, local animals that are cooked and eaten as food. We heard Dr. Newman there mention there that this is where the HIV virus came from. If we find the proper source of this virus, it's going to tell us a lot about other viruses, perhaps even the HIV/AIDS virus.
Well, that's right. It'd be really, it's very important to understand the sort of ecology of these viruses, because as you say, we may be able to find out where some of these other viruses came from And we may also be able to discover nasty viruses that haven't yet attacked man, because Ebola virus is relatively new. It's only been around a few decades. Whether it came from an evolutionary change of another virus or whether it was there already, I think most people think it was probably a new virus that appeared. So we have to be very careful. We have to be constantly looking for these viruses, because when they do infect people, as we're just hearing with the Ebola virus, the consequences can be absolutely catastrophic.
Well, Dr. Newman, it seems as though there was a period in human development where everybody got a little bit blasé about it. 70s, 80s, smallpox all but eradicated, viruses being eradicated around the world, vaccines appearing to work, measles being removed. And yet, in the mid-70s, all of a sudden, boom, something else comes up. Perhaps it was a warning not to get too comfortable about understanding the mutation and the existence of new viruses?
Well, that boom was Ebola, and it was a big one. So if you look back in history, you can look at genetic history. And inside of our genes and the genes of other animals, there are records of the kinds of viruses they've faced over time. And it looks as though bats have a copy of one of the genes from an Ebola virus from as far back as about 35 million years ago. So as humanity is pushing out into the world, we're encountering these different kinds of animals. They each have their own viruses, and occasionally, and unluckily, these viruses cross over to people. Most of the time, nothing happens, but every once in a while, you get one like Ebola.
Well, we've mentioned how difficult it is dealing with this situation. Let's just take a look. Ebola is passed on from person to person or through contact with bodily fluids. So the medical staff treating patients have to take extremely serious precautions. This video from Doctors Without Borders gives you an idea.
Pour nous protéger, on a des vêtements spéciaux.
We have special garments to protect ourselves. We wear boots, pants like this, an apron and a mask, because when you talk to a patient, saliva is present, and that's also very contagious. That's why we have the mask. We wear 2 pairs of gloves, one regular and one surgical, and we also wear goggles. After we put all that on, we're ready to go in.
Ebola is rare, but what makes it such a worry is how dangerous it is for the people who get it. According to Doctors Without Borders, since it was discovered in 1976, only 2,200 cases have been recorded. But of those patients, 1,500 have died. Now, how serious Ebola is, as we've heard, depends on the strain. But just by going on those numbers alone, Ebola kills almost 7 out of every 10 patients. Well, we can bring in another guest, Mani Nicolai. She's from the charity Doctors Without Borders, which has been on the front line against a number of these recent Ebola outbreaks. She joins us from Brussels via Skype. Mani Nicolai, we've been discussing about how virulent this virus is and the immense fatality rate. Now, some would argue that this is actually a dumb virus in that it kills its host pretty quickly, which actually stops the spreading, thankfully, of the virus more widely than we've seen to date. Would you agree with that?
Well, it remains a very dangerous virus. It spreads very easily in the community, and we know from experience that caretakers, of course, are at risk, but also funerals, as people die and they bury them very quickly. The dead body is still infectious, and we know that a lot of infections happen during funeral services. That is one of the things that we're doing now in Guinea, looking at how people are buried and giving clear instructions on hygiene during funerals.
So, Dr. Ben Newman, there we understand the immense difficulty of actually dealing with the problem on the ground, as we've seen, but that issue that I was made about the virus itself, killing off its host very quickly at this particular stage, which has allowed a certain containment with the kind of care and efforts we are seeing from the medical teams, that it has been generally isolated to particular geographical areas up to this point. Is that correct?
Yeah. Now, there are bats that carry this virus, and they are essentially worldwide, as far away as Southeast Asia and the Philippines, as they said. But the high mortality rate is how you can tell that the Ebola virus is not really a human virus. It doesn't really belong to us, because it does burn itself out by either killing off or making the few surviving patients have long-term immunity. So this is something that in the bats, however, as far as we know, they don't suffer any disease, and that's how you can tell it's probably a bat virus. They can carry it, as far as we know, for their entire lives without any ill effects.
Well, Professor Pennington, that particular point is about the bat, for example, assumed to be carrying the virus, yet remaining alive, yet within the human being fatal. Why are the animals, in a way, spared the effects of the virus?
What's happening here is that the virus has probably been living in these bats for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and the bats and the viruses have worked out a sort of, coexistence. It's only when the virus spills over into other animals which haven't seen it before, where the virus goes in humans, for example, it attacks the immune system and it attacks the blood clotting system, and that's why it's called a hemorrhagic fever, and that's why it's so catastrophic for a person who's infected. Now, to try and give an explanation of that is really very, very difficult. Why this happens when a virus moves from one species to another and becomes very nasty when it does that. We still have a lot of research to do to answer those sort of questions. And of course, that's one of the things that virologists are trying to find out. If we can answer some of those questions, we might be able to come up with better treatments, which at the moment for Ebola virus, we just haven't been able to do.
Well, Dr. Newman, it was mentioned that on outbreaks like this, in addition to the medical workers, you've also got the scientists rushing in on the ground, because the virus has got to be studied in theatre, so to speak. A very difficult virus to deal with in laboratory conditions. This brings its own problems to bear, does it not? There is like a scientific hunt going on while the situation is attempting to be contained, and people's lives people are attempting to save their lives.
For a deadly killing machine of a virus, this Ebola virus is surprisingly fragile. It has a little membrane around the outside of it, just like your cells, and if you pop that membrane, with a little pin, you can imagine, it can't infect you, it can't hurt you at all. It's, even its genetic material is RNA instead of DNA, which means it can break down very easily and quickly. Yeah, there is a scientific hunt. One of the interesting things that has turned up is the large differences between different people and how we respond to it. Depending on your genetics, you can either absolutely die from this virus or apparently suffer very few ill effects from it. And it all depends on sort of a genetic lottery.
Well, mainly, Nikolai, your people are out there on the front lines helping those who are suffering from this particular virus. So you're hearing that the experts are saying, well, some are going to be affected and some are not, yet you've got to treat it as though everybody could be affected at any stage, have you not?
Yes, so what we do, we have put out in Guinea now, for instance, we're setting up 3 treatment centers. We first looked at the epicenter of the epidemics, which is in the area of Gekidu. And then we have special material to protect the healthcare workers, because they're on the front line to treat those who are ill and who are infectious to the others. So we make a complete barrier nursing system. And you should imagine in those hospitals that we're working in the health center are already of very poor quality. So we set up a complete new area in a health center to separate those ill completely from all other staff and patients. And then we have special protective measures for our people, as you have seen in the video. So before the staff that is leaving here to go to the area, they are trained here in our office in Brussels before they leave. And then a big element of our work is also training the national staff over there, the healthcare workers, how to deal with this, how to deal with human material as well. And as I said, during funerals. So also a big work is informing the population, hygiene measures overall in health centers, etc. So we do a lot of protective work indeed.
Well, Professor Pennington, we're hearing the difficulties, the logistical difficulties of dealing and containing an outbreak of this virus. Is there the concern that it could spread further from the geographical locations to which it has generally been contained? Are we looking at the possibility at some stage of a virus that could go global?
I think to go global, I'm a little surprised if that happened. But of course, people move, and sometimes people move once they've been infected. It takes several days for the infection to show itself. And this is a way that viruses have spread throughout the world, and bacteria as well, throughout recorded history. So I think it's a little bit much to say it might go global. But on the other hand, it's certainly spread a lot in Africa. And we don't quite know how that has happened, although it's reasonable to assume it is about the movement of people, perhaps the movement of bats and so on. So there is a very large area in Africa already that it suffers from Ebola virus outbreaks. Let's hope it doesn't spread any further. We need to know more about its natural history, what's happening in those rainforests, to be able to give any assurance that this can't happen in the future. And of course, if the virus changed its host, if it moved into other animals, no sign of that happening. Let's keep our fingers crossed.
Well, Dr. Newman, I mean, that issue of keeping it contained geographically, there have been a recorded case, for example, of a nurse in South Africa who was infected while treating a doctor who unknowingly had been infected in Sierra Leone outbreak. You had one case of it moving down the continent. But in this particular case, the spread has been wider than we've seen before. We've seen it move from the borders of Guinea to the capital, Conakry. Now, there's been a much greater movement than there has been in the past. Is this perhaps because the source has been moving, or is there a fear that the virus itself is actually getting more mobile?
I think the problem is really that the virus is so slow. On average, a person is infected almost 2 weeks before they start to notice that they're infected. But during some of that time, they can presumably be transmitting the disease to other people. And this is a problem. You could hop on a plane, you could come to London. You're always going to catch this virus from close contact with a person. That seems clear. But that person could have come from, halfway across the world, the way modern transport works. I think we have to take lessons from the SARS outbreak of about 10 years ago. This was a local illness, sort of similar parameters. It also came from bats in China, but it spread into a global illness very quickly because it happened to be in a place where people were traveling out and across the world.
Mani Nikolai, from reports from your people on the ground, is this outbreak different? We've seen it is, because of its extent, it is much wider geographically than we've seen before. Are you getting initial data in about exactly how extensive it is and perhaps why it is so extensive?
It's a very difficult question to answer. What we see now, well, I said Gekedu was for us the center where we started, and then we've put up a center, an isolation ward in Macenta, and now we're working in the big hospital in Conakry. As you said, it has spread from Gekedu to Conakry, most because people have been moving. As the doctor was saying, the incubation period is relatively long, so people can move around and the virus stays inside, and with it the spread of disease. What we are investing in very much is not only taking care of the people in the isolation wards as I just described them, but what we do then, as soon as we have a case, then we do contact tracing. So we do have a whole system set up now in Guinea, and helping the Ministry of Health of contact tracing. And that's another measure to try to identify people early, follow them up, monitoring, and to try to stop the spread. But because the more we know who is at risk, the more we can take some measures to contain it.
A final question to Professor Pennington. How close are we to understanding more about this virus, the whole of how we've been saying so little is known about it?
Well, I'm sorry to say that when we have an outbreak like the one we're discussing, we do find out more facts about the virus. And it's very, very important that everybody who's involved in the outbreak, basically tells us what their experiences are, because they may be coming up with something new. On the other hand, they will be telling us about their experiences and how successful they were at controlling the outbreak. So that's really very, very important. But at the end of the day, we have to rely on our experience, but we have to be ready for these outbreaks in the future. And I'm glad to say that the other people on the program give me a lot of confidence that we are using all the information we're gathering from these outbreaks in a positive way to help those unfortunate people who've fallen ill, and to prevent those outbreaks getting any larger.
And to prevent those outbreaks perhaps at some stage from happening again. My thanks to our guests, Dr. Ben Newman, Mani Nikolai, and Professor Hugh Pennington. And do please add your voice to this discussion. Leave us your thoughts on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching from me and all the team. Goodbye for now.